Well, hello. I am Pastor Michelle from Harmony Creek Church, and today is Sunday, May 4th. And that means it is Star Wars Sunday. And all I can say is, may the 4th be with you. And so today I wanted to offer up my sermon from this morning at church for those of you who weren't able to be present or catch us online. And so let us begin, my friends, with this sermon, which comes from the gospel passage of John 21, 1 through 19. And so let us begin. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, there lived a man named Luke. Luke decided he wanted to take up ice fishing, so he finds a large covering of ice. He creates a hole and begins to fish when suddenly a booming voice calls out, "Luke, you will find no fish there." So Luke responds by simply going to another spot on the ice and proceeds to make another hole and begins to fish. Once again, the voice cries out, but this time says, "Luke, I am your father, and I'm telling you there is no fish there." So Luke now is confused, but still Luke really wants to fish. So he decides to move to another patch of ice and ignore his father. He begins fishing for the third time, and once again the booming voice calls out, "Son, I told you there is no fish there. This is an ice skating rink." So a long time ago in another galaxy far, far away, we find some of Jesus' friends and followers fishing. And like Luke, they aren't having much luck. I don't think it's because they were on an ice skating rink. So to point out that we find the disciples, they're in a boat and they're fishing because that's their livelihood. That's what they do. That's what they did for a living. And so they're fishing because they're not just fishing for fun, they're fishing for survival. But unfortunately, as we read in the gospel lesson, the disciples are having no luck. They have fished through the night and they have not caught anything. And lo and behold, there's a stranger that appears on the seashore. I imagine that they're not that far from the sea, from the beach area, because they're able to hear what the stranger says, this person in the sand. And the person says, "Well, good morning. Any luck?" And and I love that this person speaking is Jesus. And so the stranger is like, "Well," and the disciples are like, "No, we haven't had any luck at all, right?" And so the stranger, aka Jesus, says, "Well, why don't you try casting your net on the other side of the boat?" And so what happens? You can almost guess. They cast the net on the other side of the boat, and then all of a sudden they have a miraculous catch of fish. So much so that the net is really hard to even pick up out of the boat. And for whatever reason, the moment that this happens, Peter sees the overabundance of fish. And he immediately knows that this stranger is not a stranger. It is, in fact, Jesus. And so Peter gets out of the boat and runs to Jesus. And one thing to point out, because it says it in the Message translation, when Peter gets out of the boat, he first has to put on clothes. Because apparently, when they fished for a living back in the Bible, in Jesus' day, they fished naked. I don't know about you, but that's not how I fish. I just don't fish. But I just love that Eugene Peterson in the Message translation, whether or not it's in the other translations, I love that that's part of the understanding, that they want people to know Peter had to put his clothes on to run to Jesus. And so Peter gets out and runs up to Jesus. And you gotta love Peter, right? He gets there and Jesus asks them to bring so Peter gets there first, Jesus. And then the disciples obviously are not too far behind, and they finally get there. But, they need help getting all the fish out of the boat. And so Peter goes and helps them get this big net full of fish, full of 153 fish. There's whole sermons probably that have been done about the number 153 and the importance. And that's not for today. But that's how many fish there were. And it's very important to point out that the net didn't break, right? The net was so full to capacity that the net still did not break. And I think that points out that in God's net, right? And there's always going to be room for everyone. And don't worry, the net's not going to break, right? There's something to be said for that. And so, but that's a sermon for another day. So Jesus then, he invites the disciples to have breakfast with him. Jesus has prepared this meal for them. And what I shared this morning. There's this TV show that I started watching called Steven Universe. It's a kid's show, but has a very deep. It's very good messages for a cartoon. So they had this episode where Steven he makes this breakfast, and it consists of waffles, whipped cream, popcorn, and strawberries. And it's a delicious looking meal. And he looks at it and he's like, "Oh, this looks great." But he's like, "But I don't want to eat it by myself. I want to eat it with my friends." And he calls it the Together Breakfast. And he looks down, and then throughout this episode, this particular episode, he goes and he tries to find all his friends. But here's the thing: he wants to eat them. He doesn't want to eat their friends. Sorry, he wants to eat this breakfast with his friends all together. They have to all be together to eat it together, because it's a together breakfast. Everyone needs to be at the table for this, and at the end they do all get together for this together breakfast. But I think of that, and I think of this breakfast that Jesus has prepared for his friends. And in fact, I think of anything Jesus did. Any meal that Jesus was at, any time, it was always about togetherness. This was a together breakfast. It was a breakfast that Jesus had to have with his friends. And we think about communion, which we did today. Communion is a together meal. It's a meal that everyone gets to participate in. And no one ever should be excluded. No one. And so they have this together breakfast with Jesus, right? And then Jesus has an exchange with Peter. And Jesus asks Peter 3 times if Peter loves him. And scholars and theologians believe that this exchange between Jesus and Peter is Jesus' way of showing Peter that he forgives him for denying him 3 times. So here in this story, the story about a resurrected Jesus asked Peter 3 times whether or not Peter loves him. And each time, Jesus is like, "Feed my sheep, feed my sheep." And then the passage eventually ends with Jesus saying, "Follow me." That's what Jesus has been about from the start, right? Is following me. Jesus, I don't think, was ever someone that intended for us to feel like we have to believe certain theological statements about him. It was more about following him. So there's a lot going on in this passage. But I have to say, the thing I want to point out the most, and the thing that stands out to me the most, is when Jesus tells the disciples, when he's like, "You're not having much luck," he sees that, and he simply invites them to cast the net differently. And they do, and that's when they catch an overabundance of fish. And I think about this, and I think about our own story, one that we're all caught up in. The story of the church, the story of Jesus' followers, including you and I, and those who choose to follow in the way of Jesus. The story of Jesus' followers, us, doing the best we can to follow in Jesus' way. That's the story we're all caught up in. But before I say more about our own story, let's travel to another galaxy once again and talk about Star Wars. So Star Wars is a cultural phenomenon, right? I asked people on Facebook to share memories they had of Star Wars, and so many people had great stories to share. Star Wars is something that so many of us can relate to. The Star Wars story about the Force that exists within all of us, the Force that can be used for good or evil, this is a popular genre of stories. And I recently had breakfast with a good friend of mine, Joe, who used to write for his college newspaper. And one year they were doing a write-up about Star Wars. And this was around the time that the first Star Wars movie had come out. And Joe had the privilege of interviewing one of the actors from the first films. And this person had said that there was quite a bit of chaos in the making of the very first film, The New Hope. Many of the actors and even set people didn't think this movie was going to be a hit. Joe found out that most of the money went to special effects, so there wasn't a lot of money left for costumes. And he was told that stormtroopers in this first film, The costumes would often fall apart the moment the troopers began walking or moving around, which doesn't make for good costumes, right? So you think about that, and I don't think anyone knew, maybe even including George Lucas, just who would have been able to foresee it, just how famous Star Wars would become. Now, the part that stuck out to me the most about what the actors experienced was that the actors didn't know the entire script. Many times they would show up on set and just shoot their scenes and then be done. So they had to show up and play the part, even without knowing the full story. And isn't that us? We don't know the full script or the full story of everything that's going on in our world, right? It wouldn't be nice to know, but we're called to just show up and play our part. Play our part in following in Jesus' way. Play our part in trying to create a better world. Play our part in creating even a new story. A new story of creating a world that is wide enough, that includes everyone. Creating that kind of story. And I want to end with this quote from Jacqueline Lewis, who's a writer. And she wrote a really good article about how we are called to, if it's still on here, we need a new story. We're the ones to create it. And you think about, and she says, and she is a pastor, preacher, public theologian, and author. And so she says, the story I try to impress upon folks is that we are beloved partners who have agency, choice, gifts, and callings that we must use to heal ourselves in the world. This partnership is our responsibility. This partnership is our privilege. We are called to partnership like Moses was a partner, liberating God's people from enslavement. Like Mary was a partner, giving birth to a revolution of values. Like Hagar, who though kicked out of Sarah and Abraham's house because she was pregnant with Ishmael, partnered with God to save her baby and became the matriarch of Islam. And so on, like Rabbi Jesus, who partnered with God to grow a movement of love and justice. And I love what she said, our partnership with God means that we're leaders, means that we're family. And of course, right? Of course, she says we're angry and sad at the state of our nation and our world. But here's what we must do. And she says, what was it she said? I want to make sure because I didn't share this part. Psychologist Howard Thurman says that leaders tell compelling stories that change the stories that already exist in the minds of followers. I believe people want and need stories that are authentic and true, stories that answer their existential questions and make sense of their lives. Being leaders means changing the story. And she says that's what Cory Booker did for 25 hours and 4 minutes. That's what John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer, Malcolm X, Ella Baker, Ruby Sales, and Martin Luther King Jr. did. That's what Toni Morrison and James Baldwin did. The list could go on and on of people who changed the story. And that's, she says, is what we must do. We need a new story for this nation. We need a new story, one not founded on white supremacy and domination, one grounded in respect and mutual flourishing. We need a new story formed by a fundamental belief that all humans are wonderful, that we need each other to survive, that we are called to protect and steward each other in creation. We need a new story in which we are the protagonists. We don't have empathy in this new story. We have agency. We are tired in this story, but we take a break and then we jump back in and we wrestle with injustice until we defeat it. We fight until freedom comes for all of us. Because we ain't free until everyone is free. So you and I must change this story. So let's go. End quote. And I love that. And that's such a beautiful idea that we're called to change the story. Because I often talk about this, but that we're called, the systems are not broken, my friends. The systems in place in our world. The fact is they're working exactly the way they were created. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. We don't need to fix our systems. We need new systems. We need systems that create space for everyone to exist in this world. We need systems that celebrate and embrace everyone. And that's, we go back to the breakfast. We go back to the together breakfast, right? That we are called to continue creating a table in which everyone belongs. You know, throughout the month of May, I'm sharing quotes from John Pavlovich's book about building a bigger table. And we're going to go through leg by leg of different concepts that he has for what this bigger table looks like. And the concept for today in the sermon was radical hospitality. And what's more radical than making sure that our table includes everyone, no exceptions? Because every single one of us, my friends, every single one of us, we are all made in the image of God. And so let us remember that I think that we have more force in us than we realize. We have more power than we even realize. The force is strong with all of us. And the question is, what are you going to use your force for? Are you going to use it for good or for bad? Are you going to use it to uplift the world? I hope so. Sorry. I hope so. And so may God bless us, or may God keep us as we continue to use the force that we have, the power that we have, to create a new story, a new type of world, and one in which everyone knows that without a doubt that they are God's beloved. And I think in order to continue doing this work of creating a different story, it does mean, right, that we need to stop throwing our nets off the wrong side of the boat. It's time we figure out that we need to switch and see if there's abundance to be found on the other side. And so much love, my friends. Much love to you all. May you always know you are God's beloved.